much for coming on the Judgment Call podcast. Really appreciate that.
Thank,
Thanks for being here.
thank you, Torsten. Happy to join you.
So you used to work as a foreign correspondent for NPR. You worked at the New York Times, and you are the author of Bliss, The Geography of Genius, and The Socrates Express. All these are three books I really, really like, especially Bliss, one of the first ones I discovered about you. Did you ever have the idea of writing these three books, or you probably wrote more since then? Did you ever had that plan? And when did you set out to writing books instead of being a journalist?
Well, I thought, Torsten, I had the best job in the world as a foreign correspondent. And it was a great job. I was based in New Delhi and India and in Jerusalem and in Tokyo and traveled to many more countries than that. And I felt, though, as exciting and interesting as that job was, I felt something nagging at me that it wasn't quite the perfect fit for me. As I write about in my books, I'm pretty upfront about this. I suffer from sort of chronic mild depression and have all my life. And there's something about being a foreign correspondent that can bring you down even further, because really what is the job of a journalist is to focus on the negative aspects of humanity, to be honest. There's a very cynical expression in journalism: if it bleeds, it leads, meaning that, stories of war and of disease, as we've seen the past year, these are the stories that especially a foreign correspondent has to focus on. And those so-called feel-good stories are something you get to in your spare time. And I had one of those epiphanies where I woke up one day and I thought, well, what if I just flipped this on its head? And instead of traveling the world looking for the least happy people in the least happy places, what if I spent, say, a year traveling the world looking for the happiest countries, the happiest people, and what they could teach us? And that was the germ of the idea for the Geography of Bliss. And I also discovered I liked writing books. I liked really investing a lot of time into one project as opposed to, every 2 or 3 days or every hour, producing another story. I liked going deeper. I liked being more personal. And I like the world of ideas. My books are about happiness and spirituality and creativity. And so I think I discovered my true calling.
Yeah, I'm quite jealous of the trips you took. And the first book I read is Bliss, and I thought it's kind of an eat, pray, love, but for men, from my point of view.
I guess that's a compliment. I'm not sure.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay.
I think over time, and I don't. That's why I asked first if you already had this plan set out for all the books. It read quite. Bliss is a book that I really enjoyed because it reads so lightly, but there is a deeper philosophical meaning behind it. What is happiness? How can we find it? How can we reproduce it? But you make it look like this is a travelogue, and it's a wonderful, enjoyable, not busy work. It's an enjoyable journey that you undertook researching this book.
Yeah, and that is my goal, is to write books where I have a light touch, and even if it's a serious topic, and happiness, believe it or not, is actually a serious topic, as is philosophy and creative genius, and serious topics with a light touch, but not a shallow touch. And this is like the constant balancing act I'm trying to strike, between making my books accessible and even entertaining. My publisher said, "You're an entertaining writer," and he added, and I mean that as a compliment. And often in our culture, you're either serious or you're entertaining. I want to be both. I want to write about serious topics in an entertaining way. Because if my readers are entertained, that means they're paying attention, right? And that's a good thing. So I try to take complex ideas and explain them simply without oversimplifying them.
Yeah, you will. And I learned this from your reviews. There's two sides of this equation, right? There's the intellectuals that will probably say, well, your books are too flatlining. There isn't enough meat to it. And then you have readers on one side that might be still a little overwhelmed. But I think the mix that you are putting forward is wonderful. More people should do this because it's so hard to access some of that knowledge. I think it's fantastic.
And one lesson I learned early on is you're not trying to appeal to everyone. If you appeal to everyone, you're going to appeal to no one. You have to be willing to piss some people off. You have to be willing for some people, say a serious professor of philosophy might look at my latest book, The Socrates Express, and say, oh, this is too light, and that's good, right? Because if the serious professor of philosophy says, oh, this is a good, serious book, that means I lost all those other readers. So you have to be willing to not appeal to everybody so that you could have a voice. If you're a writer, you want to write with a strong voice, and not everyone's going to like it, and that's good. That means that, if some people love it, some people hate it, that's the ideal, I think.
I noticed in your books, you have a lot of observations that you make. You look at the knowledge in kind of a very granular basis, so to speak. And there's a lot of wisdom in what you say. There's one paragraph of true wisdom, and then there's two more paragraphs of where you describe a particular situation, a particular person. I find this a very interesting mix. Like, as I feel like you zoom in and zoom out in your books, like constantly. That's really interesting.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Zooming in, zooming out, and if you think about your life or anyone's life, it's filled with a combination of the trivial and the profound. And nobody lives their life profoundly every second of every day. Not even Plato did. I mean, Plato also got upset stomachs and you got frustrated by things, and all these little moments in our lives. Even the wisest, most brilliant person in the world, Einstein, had marital issues and rough relationship with his children and disputes with his landlords. I mean, you can't always be profound. And likewise, a book where every paragraph is something heavy and wise and profound, it would be almost too much. It would be you couldn't handle it. You couldn't digest it.
When all of your books are more or less based on traveling, do you feel travel is necessary to make yourself a better person? Is that something you did anyways and it helped, or do you think it is a necessary gateway?
I mean, it's it's my way of getting into a subject. Like, the first thing I think of when I've settled on a new topic is not what or who, but where. Where can I go? And there's something for me personally about preparing for a trip and taking a trip that really focuses my mind on the subject. Okay, I'm going to Athens. I'm writing about Socrates. Okay, and the act of getting on an airplane and going to Athens and walking in his footsteps, that's what triggers the deep research on my part. And my philosophy of travel is very much in line with that of the American writer Henry Miller. He once said of travel, and I absolutely love this quote. He said, "One's destination is never a place, but a new way of looking at things." And to me, that is the gold standard. That's what, as a traveler and an author, that's what I'm trying to do by taking the reader along to these places. It's not getting to Athens or to New Delhi. It's, those are, they're interesting, they're fine places, but the ultimate goal is a new way of looking at things. And travel kind of allows us to trick our minds in a way into looking at things differently. So
I feel like travel literature has gotten, and I think you're a wonderful exception to this. Travel literature has gone, say, this way of Lonely Planet. We just want to optimize our budget, and that used to be a bestseller a long time ago, and now it's hard to find. And that's my personal experience. And maybe I'm just missing out on it. I feel it's hard to find good literature that takes you to a place in the way that you, for instance, do it. That makes it interesting. There's too much information, maybe, or too little information that's entertaining to me.
Yeah, the term travel literature covers an awful lot of ground. And I know I don't mind calling myself a travel writer. I kind of wear that as a badge of honor. There are some travel writers, the late, great Jen Morris, who did not like to be called a travel writer. And I understand why, because the field includes some serious literature of the highest caliber. Thinking of authors like Paul Thoreau and Jen Morris, and other, Bruce Chatwin, who write a serious nonfiction. But travel literature also includes fluff. It includes, my trip to Hawaii, and it includes the how-to news you can use aspect of it as well. How to get the most out of your travel budget to Miami or wherever it is. And that covers a lot of ground. But at its best, travel literature, and I think it's still being done well today by a few people. But the problem is, sometimes I wish I was born 100 years ago, around the turn of the century, 1900, 1920. There was still a lot of undiscovered places in the world. And you could take a journey to, say, Borneo and write about your trip to the jungles of Borneo. And that would be reason enough for your book, or where your magazine article was, I went to Borneo. Now with Google Map and everything, there really are no undiscovered places, which is one reason I take the approach I do, which is to write at the intersection of place and idea. So there are no undiscovered places, but places still have the ability to transform us. That hasn't changed. But I think travel writing has to be more idea focused in a way, and less just, I went to Borneo, or I went to even the North Pole. People will yawn and say, I just, went there with Google Map this morning. Big deal.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. I mean, you put your finger on the wound there. It's this, you were a keen observer of people and places, but also it's seen through a prism of a particular idea. It could be, and I said that before, I had a friend and he was really interested just in the synagogues. Wherever we went, he would go to the synagogues, ideally the old synagogues first. And that was his idea of traveling. I'm like, this is interesting, but it's not the most important thing. This is, say, often in a country like Uzbekistan that isn't necessarily known for its synagogues. But it was his way of rediscovering even places where he had been before, again and again, with a slightly different theme. And I think you really simplify this.
I think your friend's onto something, even though it's not how I would travel. It would not be my first choice to look at the synagogues of the world, but I am always looking for portholes to a place. Right? Like what can help us understand this culture and compare it with other cultures? And one of the most obvious ways, which people never seem to tire of, is food. The writer, may he rest in peace, Anthony Bourdain, and the chef Anthony Bourdain has a book out now, wrote with his business partner, about the food of the world and his travels in the world. And food is one way because it's something universal, right? Everyone has to eat, but what they eat and how they eat differs. But it could be something less obvious. It could be driving. How a country handles the rules of the road explains a lot about a country. It could be something like toilets. I lived in Japan for 4 years. The toilets are fascinating. They're very high tech. They do lots of things. And there's a whole etiquette around the use of toilets and public bathrooms. And these give you a window to the culture. Right? Because you can't write about a culture directly. It's like looking at the sun during a solar eclipse. You've got to look at it from an angle, and finding those little windows into the culture, be it synagogues or driving or toilets or whatever, is helpful. Yeah.
In Geography of the Genius, you go out on a quest and try to find out if making of a genius is something we can repeat, and how did it happen, right? And you go to lots of places, Athens, China. What do you feel, as a conclusion from your journeys, do you think it's possible? Are you onto something? Is like, if someone wants to build a new Dubai or a new place with genius, he would come to you and read your book and then blueprint it, or is it much harder than you thought?
Right. See, if I took a very utilitarian approach, I would say, here is the blueprint for, I call them genius clusters. Like you said, these places that produce just an inordinate number of brilliant minds and good ideas, like ancient Athens, right up to Silicon Valley today. And I would say, here's the blueprint. Here's what you need. Go, and I might be a wealthy man, I'd probably be in my yacht in the Mediterranean, talking to you from there. But I'm not, because I don't believe in writing that kind of book where it's all laid out and, here are the steps you need to take. But there are lessons I draw. I call them the 3 Ds: diversity, discernment, and disorder. Like what did these places have in common that I examined? And they were all different in lots of ways, but they all were very diverse, not only ethnically, but in terms of ideas. They had this power of discernment, separating good ideas from bad ideas. That's important. And there was an element of disorder or even chaos. But there's an element of mystery to these genius clusters as well, in that you can't really build one, and people have tried. There have been literally hundreds of attempts to replicate the success of Silicon Valley, with Thames Valley in the UK, or Wadi Valley, I think it's called, or Silicon Wadi, as it's called, I think, in Dubai. They all these cute names, and none have really succeeded in replicating Silicon Valley, because you're talking about a culture, not a system. People confuse the two. They think that they're trying to just build a system like building a car and then you drive it away. But a culture is something living and breathing and more organic, and thus very hard to replicate. Having said that, there are things you can do. I think of it as like agriculture or like gardening. There are things you can do, like making sure the soil's in good shape, watering the plants and the flowers, things you can do to increase the odds that will have a creative culture where you live, but there are no guarantees. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So I loved how you go through the book, and there were things like the Bengali Renaissance I never knew before, my fault, or the Renaissance in China and Hangzhou, right? I don't know if it's really called the Renaissance, but it is this explosion of knowledge in that period in China. But I was curious, how do you come up with the research methodology? And I noticed you have, for each place, your methodology is slightly different. You talk to the locals, but how do you select those locals? Is it kind of random, or do you have a specific feel already for that location how do you select the people that you really want to talk to?
Well, I do a lot of historical research before I go, but very little contemporary research. I'll explain why. So I want to know the history of the place, because I can't travel back in time. So I've got to read up on the history, say, of Hangzhou, China. But I don't want to read another travel writer's impressions of modern contemporary Hangzhou, because that's going to cloud my mind. I want to have the beauty of that first impression on my own and draw my own conclusions through direct observation. As far as finding the people, I rely on what a friend of mine calls the golden thread. It's an old journalist trick, which is basically you look for someone who you might have some connection to Hangzhou. I've got a Finnish friend who's married to a Chinese woman who happens to know Hangzhou, is from Hangzhou. So I email him and say, Lars, can you put me in touch with your wife, who can put me in touch with so-and-so? And she sends me to so-and-so. And so it's not random. There's a degree of randomness, but I try to lay out the thread. And, especially the more obscure the destination, the more people are willing to talk to you. They don't get many Westerners coming to Hangzhou to find out what was happening in the 12th, 13th, 14th century there. So people want to talk to you. People respond, I think, to my attitude, which is an open mind and a curiosity about the place. And
Jack Ma to talk to you, right? That
I got Jack
cool.
Ma to open to me, which was this is the golden thread, just paying out in like lottery form, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
A friend of a friend of a friend says, Jack Ma might be willing to meet with you, and especially because I didn't want to talk to Jack Ma, who is one of the wealthiest men in China, one of the wealthiest men in the world, who started Alibaba, of course, which is sort of the Amazon Plus of China. I didn't want to talk to him about his business per se, exactly. I didn't want money from him. I didn't want anything from him, but I wanted his ideas about Chinese culture. And one thing you'll learn is that people who are very wealthy or famous, they don't get many people want to talk to them about what they really care about the most. They usually have people who are interested in more of a transactional relationship with them. So I think that's one reason why we met for tea, and I liked him. He had a lot to say, And he had the sort of the freedom to speak. Having a few $1 billion kind of frees you up to speak your mind. It's very liberating. I'd recommend it, Torsten. Get a few billion, and you too will speak freely.
Still working on that. Still working on
Okay.
that.
Yeah,
Once I figure it out, I'll write a book. So I'll send you
it's great.
The pre-release cover.
So there is this element, just like there are with these genius clusters, there is the kind of book gods up there have to be smiling upon me, and by that, I mean, you do rely on serendipity, right? But as Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. So you have to be ready for those moments. When a friend of a friend of a friend says Jack Ma's in town and he'll meet with you for tea, you've got to be ready to go, and you've got to have that mindset of, why not try to meet with Jack Ma? He's from Hangzhou. Maybe he'll meet with me. You never know if you don't try.
Yeah. Well, I like, and this is, I think, a testament to that openness, how you describe situations, what you learn from homeless people that you met in Frankfurt. I remember when you researched Schopenhauer, and on the other side, you're hobnobbing with the billionaires. But you have this perspective that draws these people. You draw a certain persona that you see when people, you encounter these people. And I thought this is quite genius the way you do it. I rarely ever see someone else doing it in such a prolific manner.
Thank you. And the key is to throw away a lot of research, or rather to put it on the cutting room floor. So I read a lot, like about Schopenhauer. I read academic books. And then there's always this paring down of what you've written and what you have.
Yeah.
And, like the making of a Japanese sword, when they make them, they take out the impurities, one process after another of removing impurities from the metal until you have left with this very dense sword. It's not that big, but it's heavy and dense, and it's the essence of the sword. And that's the writing I've always admired. I've been, watching the Ken Burns documentary about Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway, recently. So Hemingway's on my mind. And, Hemingway did that. Hemingway, of course, was a minimalist, but he wanted to write clearly. And he said that when he was stuck, he would sit up on the roof of his apartment in Paris, overlook the rooftops, and say, well, Ernest, you just have to write one true sentence. And I like that quote, because you have to write one true sentence and then build on that. And if you have sentences that aren't true, and by true I don't mean like made up, but I mean just aren't true to the book, aren't true to the mission of the book, you have to get rid of them. The poet Allen Ginsberg said you have to kill your darlings. And some people are confused by that. Why would you want to kill your darlings? But I think what he means is those sentences that you're so in love with because they're so flowery and beautiful and clever, if they're not serving the mission of the book, kill them. Get rid of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's hard to know, right? And I realize that you write a lot, probably.
That's why we have editors. They kill our darlings for us. Right?
Yeah. Well, they have to earn their salary. When you look back a couple of years ago, did you always want to write about philosophy? Is it something that always drew you in, or is it something that you recently discovered as just another thread to see the world through?
Well, I realized I've been writing about philosophy. I just didn't call it that. So the book about happiness, the geography of bliss, before psychology, there was philosophy. Before physics, there was philosophy. There was only philosophy. Physicists, in the 16th, 17th century weren't scientists. That word didn't exist yet. They were natural philosophers. And likewise with happiness. The study of happiness predates the field of psychology. It was philosophy. And in so many ways, if you're interested in the world of ideas, you are by definition, I think, interested in the world of philosophy. And I realized, well, why not just tackle that head on then? Why skirt around it? Why not just write about philosophy and write about it in an accessible, compelling way? So it seemed like a natural fit for me.
Yeah, Socrates Express is such a great introduction to philosophy. There aren't that many.
Thank you.
I had Stephen Smith on, and he does an introduction on YouTube about political philosophy. But
Oh, yes.
I always feel it is difficult to access this topic. Everyone feels like I don't want to get drawn in because it's too complicated. I will be disappointed by my own level of competence, and I don't want to read that much. And I think you put it in 300 pages. That's
Yes.
the whole size of the book.
Yes. After undergoing what my editor calls editorial liposuction, trimming down. And my agent said, look, Eric, you can write a big book or you can write a book about philosophy, but you cannot write a big book about philosophy because it's going to be too intimidating to people. And I think it was very good advice.
Yeah.
Look, you mentioned Stephen Smith and political philosophy. There are many kinds of philosophy, and there is a place for, logical positivism, which is a complicated rules of logic that's almost mathematical in its precision. But there's another kind of philosophy, which is really how philosophy began, that I felt just gets ignored today, which is philosophy for everyday living. Philosophy comes from the ancient Greek word philosophia, which means literally love of wisdom. A philosopher is someone who loves wisdom. Yeah. And we're all looking for wisdom in our lives. I mean, we may not articulate that, but when you read a self-help book, or you watch Oprah or Dr. Phil, or you ask a friend for advice about what do I do about this dispute at work, whatever it is, you're looking for wisdom. So why not turn to this discipline of philosophy, which has been thinking about wisdom for 2,000 plus years? But it's buried, it's hidden in this code, or it's just not, it's, as you say, it's presented as this difficult subject where you have to have a PhD and you have to read all these difficult texts, and it'll probably give you a headache and you'll just be more confused than you were before you started. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, I always think of philosophy as a scaffolding of another world that is kind of invisible. It's an abstract layer that makes pattern recognition easier, obviously. And we have a lot of these philosophy books are actually very accessible. So when I read Plato's Republic, I thought it's really an easy read. I mean, there is sections where it gets a little confusing, but generally it is not harder to read than, I don't know, most novels that are being published today. So a lot of this is, I think people are intimidated often by the size of what they heard about the book than when they actually would open up the book.
And what's interesting is the further you go back in philosophy, the easier it gets, actually. Usually things are more, we think of like the ancients as being difficult and the moderns as being easier, but that's not the case. In fact, you go back to Plato and Socrates, who never wrote anything, but Plato wrote about him. And particularly, I'm thinking of what they call the Hellenistic philosophies, which these were the philosophers right after Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle came the Stoics, and came the Epicureans. And these were really schools of life, really. I mean, you would go there and you would study, you would do athletics, and you would talk about how to live a better life. And you would also talk about metaphysics and what's it all mean and those big questions too. And then, philosophy took a wrong turn for about 1,000 years, I think, and became scholastic and became difficult, and sort of relegated the big questions of the meaning of life to religion, and like, well, we're not going to go there. And then it has come back, and there's been a thread throughout, the Nietzsche and the existentialists. I mean, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, they were very much interested in leading meaningful lives. Not always easy to understand, but they were tackling the big questions. And we don't really have room for that, Torsten. We so much of our life is about making more money or getting ahead in our career, or just, staying afloat in this past year. And unless, you are a religious person, and fewer people identify as religious, if you've seen those numbers are going down, where do you have to turn to sit down and talk about the big questions, the meaning of life, how to lead a meaningful life, all these questions? Philosophy is one place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is fewer outlets for this. And I think the rise of Christianity, yes, it is a religion, but it's also a philosophy. I think it answered a lot of those philosophical questions for people. And it's not put into the same box as other philosophies right now, which I think is a mistake. It should be seen as such. Obviously, it goes a little beyond that. But one thing I really noticed when he wrote in the Socrates Express about most relatively recent, say the last 300-400 years philosophers, they seem incredibly miserable. They're all hermits. They barely leave the house for years. They're not being recognized by other people around them. Isn't that, when we learn about them, isn't there a danger that we make ourselves feel miserable? Because obviously they gave us something, they gave us a huge body of knowledge, but for themselves, it didn't work out that way. They were mostly depressed.
Mostly depressed, but not all depressed. Like, look at Schopenhauer, who was a kind of misanthropic grump. You're right. But he loved his dog, Atman, his poodle. He loved music, as I write about. He went to the opera, and he was fascinated by Buddhism. We're talking in the 19th century, well before, everyone, every third person's a Buddhist today, or an amateur Buddhist, right? It's so
At least in
been
New York City.
popularized. Yeah, in New York City, definitely. So, but he was an early adapter, as they say. So just because a philosopher did not achieve a blissful existence does not mean that we don't have things to learn from them. My wife always says that I'm much wiser on the page than I am in real life. And when I say, what should I do? She's like, page 212 of your latest book, it's all there. I'm like, oh, yeah. So you can put it down in writing, but not be able to follow it. There's value in talking the talk, even if you can't walk the walk, and
Yeah.
What all the philosophers have in common is they do question assumptions, right? Most of us don't. We go through life on autopilot. So these philosophers, the ones I chose to write about at least, were never on autopilot. They were always questioning the assumptions. And that is going to make you, by definition, a little bit unhappy, I think. I mean, we are social animals. And if you're going to be the guy questioning assumptions, rocking the boat, the other people on the boat are not going to like you that much, right? Certainly the captain's not going to be a big fan of yours. So I think it is kind of baked into the profession, or the mindset, really, being a philosopher, is you're going to piss some people off. You may not have that many friends, but the reward hopefully is greater of really a deeper understanding of what it means to be human and what life means. And again, passing on wisdom that you yourself, it's like you come up with a great recipe, but you just can't, you're no good in the kitchen. You can't cook it, but here's the recipe, and you pass it on, and maybe someone, a future generation, a relative, a descendant, will be like, oh, this is a great recipe, and I can cook. So these philosophers, they present us with recipes, and we add to them, we change them a bit, and we try to cook the dish ourselves.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison. I just feel as more we ponder with these questions, and that's like Goethe's Faust, right? As more you become interested in the big questions, as more you move out there, you're being seen as arrogant. You're being seen as someone who's asking questions that I don't want to deal with, right? I just want to enjoy my life. I want to be living in that life. I want to make money. I feel there is this danger that Goethe writes about. When we get to that point that we are enamored by these big questions, we lose touch with life and what's around us. And this typical life that makes humans happy, which 90% of our life, 99% of our daily life, becomes irrelevant to us. And that's really dangerous, I feel, to fall into this trap once you get into philosophy.
Well, I think that is one danger, but it doesn't need to be that way, which is why I include philosophers in the book who people would not consider philosophers, like, say, Shonagon, who was a writer and a courtier in Kyoto, which was the capital of Japan, about the year 1000. And she wrote a charming, intriguing little book called The Pillow Book. No one knows why it's called The Pillow Book, but there you have it. And it's a bunch of observations and lists about life in imperial Japan, in Kyoto at that time.
Yeah.
And she's very good at appreciating the great beauty of small things. And the Japanese, to this day, have this aesthetic sense. of design. And there's the Japanese brand Muji, which you may have heard of. They're in New York now. They're around the world. It means literally no brand. Very simple designs, everyday objects rendered very simply. And the Japanese know there's great beauty in that simplicity. And that is a kind of philosophy. Philosophy doesn't just have to be these big, sprawling, intellectual ideas. There can be philosophy conveyed through objects of art and through everyday objects. That's aesthetics, essentially. So there are many different ways of living a philosophical life, and only one of them is the kind that you're talking about, of having such big ideas and you're just tripping over your shoelaces are untied while you're thinking about metaphysics walking down the street, if that's what you're talking about. Well,
you know so much about cultures and about how they developed, how philosophy inspired them, or how they created this philosophy. Do you feel we are on this kind of odd arc these days, where I call it the Old Testament arc, where we are so convinced about technology, and this has become, as you say, the Greeks were not really interested in technology that much. We are on this strange arc where we pray to the gods of technology now, as that's a conclusion of many hundreds and thousands of years. And do you think there's something to this theory, or there is this natural progression always to technology, and we're the bootloader for AI, so to speak, and they will create us, will take us to the stars?
Big question, and I could talk for hours about it. I've got strong feelings about this. But let me see if I can put it in succinct terms. You're right that the ancient Greeks, who brought us theater and democracy and so many words that we're using right now, speaking in English, come from the ancient Greeks. So much of Western civilization, if you go to the U.S. Capitol, the design of the building is an ancient Greek design. So much of what we consider civilization, yet they didn't really care for technology as we define it, gadgetry and devices and things like that. They were not that interested in it. Yet today, when we think of progress and the way we define progress, it's almost exclusively in technological terms. So if you were to say to someone, picture the future 100 years from now, they will picture in terms of technology. Will there be flying cars? What kind of, wearable technology will we have? And why is that the only way to gauge human progress? What about moving towards justice and greater love? I mean, those are more abstract ideas. They're harder to picture. They're harder to make. But the Greeks at least thought they were more important than technology. If Steve Jobs were to be transported to Athens of 300, 400 BC, they would not be impressed with his, iPhone device. They'd be like, what are your ideas, Steve? What are your ideas about democracy and justice and courage and poetry? And, there's a quote at the beginning of Geography of Genius: what is honored in a country is cultivated there.
Sounds
that
like
is
Bezos. Yeah.
Yes.
What is measured doesn't exist.
That's a little bit different, because measuring something is one thing, and honoring it is something else. In a way, you could argue that to measure something is to diminish it, right, and not to honor it, right? I would argue that, because the things that matter the most to us, things like love and happiness, are the most difficult to measure, and in a way seem kind of silly to some people, at least to measure. To measure a father's love for his daughter would, to some people, and I think I'd be one of them, is seen as diminishing that love. You
True,
want to
but
measure.
it's a focus, right? We focus on something, and then it becomes relevant to us. And with the honor,
yes,
we obviously can't measure these things. We can't measure love and big emotions that are important to us. So that's
right. But
I think where the similarities lie. But you're right.
Yeah, I agree. So what is honored in a place is cultivated there. So people will ask me, like, well, why don't we have any Mozarts today? Where are the Leonardo da Vinci's? It's not that genetically humans have changed. There's no one born with the genetic predisposition toward music, the great musical talent of Mozart. People are born like that every day. And there are great composers of classical music composing today, but we don't honor them, right? So we don't elevate them to the status of genius, and we don't cultivate them in that we don't, how many parents say, I want my child to go to college, go to grad school and become a great poet or composer of classical music. No, they want them to go to Silicon Valley and start a company or do something like that. And so if I've learned anything in all these books, is that what we take to be just the way things are, that technology is good, period. You have to question that. It means that's the way things are here and now, in our place, in our time. But is that a universal truth or not? And I don't think the notion that greater technology equals greater human happiness, that you could make a very strong case that that's not true, and that technology causes more problems than it solves.
Yeah, one thing that I always struggle with when I talk to people who have studied philosophers is what we have with technology. It stacks so beautiful on the previous layer. So when you go to GitHub, you download whatever you want in terms of code repository. You just change a couple of lines, and you made it better, more efficient, and you get awarded for this. Maybe you make a few $1 million, right? So it's a tiny little effort, but you sit on the shoulders of giants of the last 200 years at least, if not longer. With philosophy, I think it's a little harder. When you come up with a new philosophy and want to be recognized for this, yes, you will be inspired by everyone who's already there if you have time to read and understand it, which is, again, you don't have to do it with code. You don't have to understand it. You can plug and play into your new solution. But with philosophy, you have to re-engineer it, so to speak, and start from scratch and then come up with your own first principles. By the time you're 90 years old, and nobody would probably notice that you even did something throughout your whole life. So technology has this beautiful scaling technology that's probably inbuilt, that philosophy, for instance, or art never really developed.
Wow. Interesting point there. One of the problems with being alive in the year 2021, well, there are many problems with being alive in 2021, but one of them is that there's so much that came before, and there's such a large canon of information and knowledge, say with philosophy, that if you feel you can only add to a new field of knowledge by reading everything that came before, you will be 90 years old maybe when you finish reading everything before, and then you die before you have a chance to add to it. Yeah. One advantage of being, Plato is there were only so many philosophers around before him, not that many, and you could actually get up to speed pretty quickly on the canon, the body of knowledge, and then start working on how can I add to it? And now if you feel compelled to read everything that came before you add, Torsten's 2 cents to philosophy or your own idea, it's going to take a long time. And you make an interesting point about technology. I think what you're saying is you don't have to do that with technology. Just all the code's there. You add a few new lines of code and people call you a genius, without recognizing what came before you. Is that your point?
Yeah, exactly. Like there's Maria Mazzucato. She goes all the way and says, well, think about the iPhone. It's basically all taxpayer money. So Apple didn't do anything. They stole lots of technology that was either open source, or they just stole it from somewhere else. It's like the whole Silicon Valley. I think it's also coming up in your book. And then it was just commercialized, and all of this is basically taxpayer investment that's now being the harvested as profits from Apple. I wouldn't go that far, but there is this beautiful thing with technology that you literally just download it, even if it's hardware. You can download some designs now, blueprints from someone else in China, for instance. So it's so much easier. And I don't think philosophy or many of the other categories that you talk about, music, they give you the same access that you literally wake up as a 20-year-old, have 2 years of learning, and then another year of trying things out, and then you can be a genius. That doesn't happen there anymore.
No, and part of the problem is that we're much quicker to accept a new technology than we are a new philosophy or a new religion. I mean, people, if you said to me that you have a new religion called Torstenism, and it's just, it's great. People would be very skeptical, like, really, a new religion? I mean, what are your credentials? What are you talking about? Are you nuts? But if you said you had a new app or a new technology, the automatic inclination is to give you the benefit of the doubt and say, oh, that's so cool. It's great, and so we we suspend all our natural skepticism of other fields when it comes to technology. And we're much more willing to accept something as, because it's new, it's therefore brilliant. And we don't, when it comes to religion and spirituality or philosophy, we don't necessarily believe that. But we for some reason, we have a blind spot with technology. And, look, there's a role for philosophers, I think, in this world, this high-tech world, more than ever. And it's not just the ethical considerations of the auto drive system on a new Tesla. There are ethical considerations, but I'm just amazed that more people aren't asking questions about, is this technology really, is it good? Is it something that we should support? There, you get that conversation stopped by the comment that you cannot stop progress. So that shuts down the conversation. People say you cannot stop progress, but philosophy would say, well, yes, you can. You can ask questions about these human systems and about technology, and you can redefine what progress is. So we need philosophers and philosophy now, I think, more than ever. And so it's not this antiquated subject. If you think of philosophy as the art of asking questions, what is more important than that? Asking good questions. And it's the one subject you will not learn in school, in any school, the art of asking questions. You learn lots of answers and facts in school. You might learn some statistical methodologies, but you don't learn exactly how to ask questions. And that's the most human thing we do, is ask questions.
Yeah, I think philosophy is in the hearts of many people's discovery right now for a couple of things. A, they have more time, and AI will give them even more time because things get easier. We sit at home, and I think this is not an accident, and we all suddenly want to sit at home and watch Netflix because we can, right? We can almost do the same thing we did before, and by sitting at home. And once we have this time, we sooner or later come about the big questions, and then we might be interested in philosophy. Obviously, that's a journey. And this asking the right questions, I think this is what I think is about to change. Once we have potentially AI that can come up with big algorithms that kind of make it all look like software. Like we say, software is eating the world, and I think the same will be true for AI. It's just another software layer. It can actually, you can play like Beethoven tomorrow if you download that software, or at least the computer can, and you can, change it a little bit and do something with that. So I think the world in AI speak, it becomes a model. And the model is basically, it's hard to produce, but once you have the model, it's like a philosopher's mind, so to speak, we can download it, not the mind, but the essence of what that person would say if we would have that person in the room. And logically, and also, we can even make it sound like that person. And once we have that, we can really just play with the model, add a little bit of code to it, and then we create something new that might be better. So what I'm trying to say is the software eating the world is coming to philosophy and to art and to all the other fields. And maybe we'll once again see all these geniuses coming up in these areas.
I hope so. I keep coming back to what is honored in a country is cultivated there. And AI is not going to change. We confuse process with substance. AI may speed up the process of producing cars or however we conduct business, but it's not going to provide the content, and it's not going to decide what matters and what doesn't. The historian and philosopher Will Durant once said something very nice, very telling, I think, about why he was interested in philosophy. He said he wanted to know that the big things are big and the small things small, and he wanted to know before it was too late. And I think there's great wisdom in that. What matters and what doesn't. AI cannot tell us what matters. If we decide that building lots of freeways is what matters, then AI will help us build lots of freeways or whatever it is. But technology is content empty in essence. It's all about process. And it favors certain kinds of communication. Television favors the visual, obviously, but the content is up to us. And we also choose to elevate some technologies over others. We think, well, it's just, it just happens that the internet came along, and that, well, no, we make choices to support it, to log on to it, to use it. And I think it's a mistake to abdicate our responsibility and say, well, it's just all here. We have no choice. And it feels that way, because imagine if you decided you didn't like email, you never wanted to use email, and you applied for a job and they saw your qualifications and said, oh, you're very well qualified. You say, oh, but by the way, I don't use email. I don't like email. And it's a personal thing, but so I won't communicate by email ever. I mean, that would be a problem, right? So, So we get hooked into the system without ever questioning the system. And to come back to philosophy is about asking those questions, not the little questions like how can we get more megabytes per second out of this network, but why do we have the network in the first place? What if we got rid of it? Who is it benefiting? Those questions, right? And those are the questions that are kind of annoying, and they're kind of, if you ask them all the time, your friends are probably going to leave you and say, Torsten's always, every time we're on a Zoom call, he's questioning the utility of Zoom and why we have it. And, but someone's got to ask those questions at some point, right? And that's where philosophy comes in.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I want to talk about journalism from your point of view. What happened to journalism? And we all know there's big changes were afoot over the last 20 years. Can you see there's something good in there? I mean, I assume, and that's my assumption, it might not be, you might be on a different, coming from a different viewpoint. I assume that journalism that we had, the big investigative journalism by people like you, probably people with tons of experience and a way to discover the truth, that seems to be gone. And we have the opposite. We have the opposite of, making things up and just getting the clicks and just moving on the next day or like 2 hours later. Is there something positive in what happened to journalism?
Wow. So when do the easy questions come, Torsten? Or we get to that in the second hour? At the end.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
Good. Okay, here's my take. Before, as in all of humanity up to now, the problem has been a lack of information. We needed more information, right? And now, for the first time in human history, it's been flipped on its head. And our everyday problem, is that we have too much information. And increasingly, the job of journalism and journalists is to help people make sense of that information and to weed out the good information from the bad information. And that's new, right? I mean, there is good journalism out there. You could go online right now and find it, but you'd have to find it, right? In the days of Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein, it found you, right? It arrived on your doorstep in the form of the Washington Post or the New York Times. So increasingly, the job of journalists and editors is to help readers and people make sense of all the information that's out there. There is such a thing as too much information. People don't realize, they just think, oh, we just need more information, more knowledge. No, information can actually, it can harm you. It can make your life less worth living, not more. It can confuse you. It can make you less wise. So that is one way in which the role of journalism is changing. And the other thing that's changed is trust. In the geography of bliss, one of the conclusions I reach about happy places is that they all have high levels of trust. Happy places are places where people trust and trust one another. And unhappy places are places where people are envious of one another and highly distrustful. So what's it have to do with journalism? Well, the journalism is only as good as it is trusted, right? If no one trusted Woodward and Bernstein in the era of Watergate, nothing would have happened to Richard Nixon. People would have just dismissed it. And so we have a not so much a crisis of journalism, but as a crisis of trust. Two things. We have this data smog, as I call it, going on, just too much information, and we can't make sense of it all. And then related to that is this trust issue that, well, do I trust Fox News, or do I trust, what my friends are sending me? Do I trust what's on Facebook? And I don't know how we sort that out. I mean, there are a lot of people thinking about this and working on it, but it's not going to be technology companies. It's not going to be the social media platforms that solve this problem for us. They are symptom and cause of the problem. So I think we have to find a way to help us make sense of the world and to have journalism that we know we can trust.
Yeah. Well, we all, I think, agree that there was a lot of positive things about the old model of journalism, and that's kind of went out the window. And what we have, this depth, we have way more information, as you say, but we also have way more micro journalism, so to speak. I mean, there is decent documentaries from people that have no clue how to do a documentary, right? It's still in its infancy. It might get better, or it might.
No, or that's so-called citizen journalism. Micro journalism, okay, I'm not sure. And by that I mean local news is suffering. I can. If you live in New York or Washington, you're lucky that you have the Washington Post and the New York Times. If you live in Des Moines or San Antonio or my hometown of Baltimore, the newspapers are barely surviving. So you don't really have local news. What you have is anybody can say they're a journalist, right? It's not like being a brain surgeon. We have to go to school and get degrees. You can say, I got a camera, I'm a journalist. And that's good and bad. I mean, it's good. It means we've got eyes and ears on the police and on everything else that's going on, and that creates transparency. But what I learned, growing up and becoming a journalist is, there are certain ethical standards and ways you do things. And someone, running around with an iPhone or a video camera may not have those. It's tricky because you don't want to be like an elitist saying, oh, you have to go to school to be a journalist and you have to have, credentials. But if journalism is just storytelling and making stuff up, then getting back to that trust issue, where's the trust? The stories we read in the New York Times have impact because a lot of people still trust the New York Times, that what they're writing in there is true or mostly true. And that is really the only asset that a news organization has. It's not the buildings or the printing presses. It's that trust. Trust is social capital. Yeah.
Like a brand. Yeah. When you're a very astute student of history, so you probably have seen this, but we go through these phases of information overload. Like think about the printed book, the printing press, right? So suddenly there was a ton of information available. You couldn't get your hands on the Bible, and suddenly it was cheap. Everyone could get 5 Bibles and a Quran thrown in. And then it moved on to newspapers, and then it moved on to TV, and then it moved on to the internet. So we go through these phases periodically. That's what I'm trying to say. And Edward Tanner told me this. It's once we reach such a phase, there's 2 things involved. A, we increase specialization because we can, right? We know there's other people around us and they share their information with us, like the geniuses. We all need to share the information to an extent. And then also, because of that, our productivity rises up. We suddenly get so rich. But in this upheaval phase, and we are obviously in one of those, or we have been since the 90s, in these upheaval phases, it gets pretty messy. We had a lot of people blame the Reformation. Blame is maybe the wrong word, but they say the Reformation was basically information overload. It was triggered by information overload. And do you think we will, and that's why I asked for the positive things, that we will come to this, to a golden period, the next 20 or 30 years, or we will be on the other side where we feel like, man, we do so many things wrong. We only worry about technology and philosophy. It's not a big deal anymore. We are doing some big decisions. We're doing them incorrectly.
That's the big question. Every technology brings advances, but at a cost. And I'm reminded of Socrates, who, as wise as he did not like the printed books, or the written word as it was back then. There was no printing press. And he was against books. He thought that it would hurt people's memories. They wouldn't be able to recite Homer's Odyssey or great poems, and that they would not absorb information by reading it the same way as speaking, right? And humans have been speaking centuries longer than they've been reading. Well, Socrates was right
Yes.
in that because we have books and never mind ebooks, just books and books that we don't have to memorize all these things. But what he missed out on is the advantage of having all these books and access to greater information. And then along comes the printing press, and all of a sudden there's this explosion of information. I've been researching Benjamin Franklin, who was a printer and who brought the newspapers and pamphlets to the New World, to the early United States. And it was very liberating and it was terrific. But more of a good thing is not always a good thing. And it's like money and happiness, right? So there've been all these studies that show that despite these romantic notions of the poor, happy people, that no, poor people in poor countries are unhappy. They're just unhappy. Statistically, this is true. And as you get wealthier and wealthier, you get happier and happier. But then you reach a plateau. And it's pretty low, like about $70,000 a year in the US, less overseas. Once you hit that level, any further increases in money are not really going to make you happier, right? But you keep trying to earn more money because it worked before. So the same thing can apply to information, Torsten. What I think is we going from a dearth of information to now we have more and more information. And this is great, right? We now have so much. On this one little device, I have all of human history, all of human knowledge from the ancient Egyptians to theoretical physics on my phone. That's terrific. So that should make me lead a richer life than someone from 2,000 years ago. But we've hit that plateau, like the money happiness plateau. And more information is not making us happier, but we're stuck. We just think, okay, we need more information. We need faster internet speeds. We need more of this and more podcasts. And sorry about podcasts. We
We'll cut that out, Eric.
We'll cut that out. The world can always use another podcast.
You didn't say anything about YouTube yet. Yes.
No.
I heard YouTube. They get every second they get like 5,000 hours of video uploaded. Look, it's insane.
Right. So at what point does somebody say, hey, maybe the problem isn't more information? Hey, maybe the problem isn't, money. I need more money to be happier. I need more information to be wiser. Maybe it's something else. And it's getting us as humanity to sort of shift our focus. Gets back to that quote from Henry Miller about travel. One's destination is never a place, but a new way of looking at things. And it's this vision thing that is important. The great geniuses I write about in the Geography of Genius, like Einstein and others. Einstein, he didn't know more physics than other people. There were other physicists living at the same time as Einstein who knew more physics, right? But they didn't see more than him. He wasn't a know-it-all so much as a see-it-all. And if you see what I'm saying, that is the shift that we have to take, a new way of looking at problems and looking at situations, not just more information or more money or, that's often, when we hear about terrorist attacks, for instance, people will say it's because they're, economically depressed. Terrorists, they come from poor places where they don't have, enough. And that's not the case. They often, terrorists tend to be from middle-class families, but what they have is envy. They have a lack of a purpose in their life, these more intangible things. And, we have to shift our focus often to, it's not this, it might be that. And that gets back to asking questions, our ability to ask questions, like your good questions. I mean, that's what we're doing philosophy right now, by the way. This is philosophy. We're having a conversation.
Yeah, I like how you, and I think it was it's in the Socrates Express, you write about the dialectic style, that's Socrates' style, right? And you just put it down and say, well, it's just asking questions. But why do people invent this word? And I really like that because that's what it is, right? But it's, if you listen to any philosophy class online or to YouTubers who are philosophers, it's not easily accessible because they use all these words. And well, I consider myself well-trained in some complicated words. It's still intimidating until you listen to all the episodes and then you eventually know. Like epistemic, That's something I still struggle with, right? But it's like a philosophical.
How we know stuff. There, epistemology is how do we know stuff.
Yeah,
it's that simple, and it's helpful to use just to go to the other extreme and use oversimplified language too, because every one of those words in philosophy, how do we know stuff, is epistemology, and all those complicated words can be described using the vocabulary of a 10-year-old. But okay. I have feelings about jargon. That would be
a great research project to do that.
Yeah, I feel like jargon is used to keep someone at a distance. It's to put up a barrier between me and you. And what I try to do in my books and my writing is to break down those barriers, and that means writing jargon free and picking apart the jargon and say, what are we really talking about here?
I touched upon this a little earlier. When you think back to all the philosophers you've studied and the philosophers philosophy you looked at, what is the one that had the biggest impact on you? Is it the Stoics?
Oh, that's a tough one. It's sort of like, who's your favorite child? The Stoics are good, and they've been very helpful the past year or so, the pandemic, because the Stoics teach us that we cannot control external events. And this past year has made that abundantly clear, but we can control our reaction to them. And that has been a valuable lesson. But actually, even more than the Stoics from the same time period is Epicurus. And I keep coming back to him. He is misunderstood because to say you're an Epicurean today means that you like gourmet food. And there's a website, Epicurious, with all kinds of recipes for gourmet food. And in fact, that's not what the real Epicurus, historical figure from about 300 BC, was about. He was about simple living and deriving the most pleasure as you can from simple living. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, for the man to whom nothing is not a, no, let me see if I have this right. Basically, if enough is not enough, nothing will ever be enough for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
In other words, if you don't know how much is enough, you're never going to be satisfied. And he goes through and he talks about the different kinds of pleasures. And he thought that the ones that were the deepest were the simplest. And that, you know, a simple meal is easy to obtain. You don't have to do much. It doesn't cost a lot of money. And that's good. And if you go out to a fancy restaurant and you have a lobster dish and it's all fancy and delicious, you will enjoy it, but then you will have created a habit of expecting it. You have raised your expectations. And now in order to relive that happiness, you have to relive that lobster meal. So he actually was about simplicity and is misunderstood that way. So he is very relevant, I think, to our age of excess as well. I'm sort of cheating by throwing in a few one favorites. Montaigne, who was a French essayist and philosopher, also lived during a time of epidemic. It was the bubonic plague during his time, and he escaped to his country house, as many people are doing today, and went up to his tower and wrote his essays. And he wrote about everything. He sort of ended his conversation with the world and began his conversation with himself. And that ultimately is what philosophy is about. Plato said that when a man is thinking, he is having a conversation with himself. And that's what Montaigne did up in his tower. And like me and maybe you, he'd read a lot of philosophers. And now he's like, okay, now what do I think? There was nowhere to go. There was a plague and wars going on outside his little tower in the French countryside. So he thought about these things and he opined. And, you know, the funny thing is, Torsten, we live in an age where, you know, everyone can have an opinion about anything, right? Online. You can mouth off about anything. You could have a podcast and say whatever you want, right? But but at the same time, we don't feel like there's so much specialization. You used that word earlier. We didn't get the chance to talk about that. There's so much specialization that sort of crowds us out, you know. Well, I don't know much about coffee. I'm not an expert, so I can't tell you what coffee I like, or I don't know much about philosophy. I'm no expert. So we don't trust our own feelings about things, our own thoughts and feelings, because we're not specialists. We're not experts. And Montaigne lived in an age where you could still be an amateur enthusiast about everything. Um, so he wrote about life and death and everything in between. And as he writes, he gets increasingly confident in his own opinions. He starts off by quoting a lot of the ancients, Seneca, the Romans, and the Greeks. And as he goes on, he gets more opinionated and more confident in his own opinions. But ultimately, his motto is, "What do I know?" That's sort of his what he had above his ceiling was "What do I know?" And I don't think he meant it in like, "Oh, I don't know anything," but it's this questioning of things. But what do I really know? And we have these ideas that we get that we just we know we need more money, but why? What do I know? And we need more fame, but why? What does success? You need more success. What does success look like? Would you know it if you saw it? So it's this weird he had this weird combination of being very confident in his opinions, but at the next sentence questioning what he just said, and revisiting it. So he's like going from conviction to conviction and circling back. And I admired that in him. And he was like me. He was an amateur philosopher. He was, just kind of winging it, and had lots of time on his hands because of the bubonic plague.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one thing that's needed is this, I like how you phrase it, the amateur enthusiasm that's very common with entrepreneurs. And we sometimes think of entrepreneurs as hustlers, and it's just about the next sale. There is this part of entrepreneurship, but there is also this idea generation, hatching out a new idea, just seeing the world through often a science fiction lens, for better or worse. And coming up with ideas how the world could work, and how close is the current technology or something I can build or something more artistic to this, and how can I get there
Right.
relatively quickly. So it's a bit of, many entrepreneurs are complete amateurs in wherever they're going, and then they learn relatively quickly or not. But if they do, then they have a business to build on.
Right, and they are what have been called possibilians. Right, they believe
Yeah.
in something's possible,
Yeah.
and that is great. I actually think that we need more possibilians out there. People who think, well, maybe that's possible. And that is how Silicon Valley began, with this sense of anything's possible. But I think it's lost some of that early enthusiasm and that early idealism. Just because everything's possible doesn't mean everything should be done. And I think they aim too low, actually. It's coming up with a new app to save money on car insurance. Well, that's not the same as a polio vaccine or going to the moon, or, making a more loving world. So we tend to get blinded by, oh, it's new, it's an app, it's new. And so it's not that the technologists of Silicon Valley are aiming, too high. They're not aiming high enough. And they sort of wrapped up these small incremental advances in this glitzy packaging and said, oh, now here, this is something really new. And is it? And just because something is new doesn't mean it's monumental, doesn't mean it's a work of genius. In fact, people will say, well, ask me, how do you define genius and a work of genius? And I like the three criteria that the patent office has. It has to be new, but it also has to be practical. It has to be useful. It has to advance the field. And if I were to come up with a new coffee mug that had no bottom to it, that would be new. Hey, no bottom on the coffee mug. Not very practical. If I were to come with a coffee mug that was green instead of blue, that would be, kind of useful and kind of new, but it's not that leap. Schopenhauer put it this way. He said, talent hits the target no one else can hit. Genius hits the target no one else can see. So it's that visionary leap of seeing. And once you hit the target that no one else can see, you've got to get everyone else to see it. Or you're just crazy, right? You're just some guy hitting invisible targets. You've got to get everyone else on board.
I'm fully with you. I think we owe this reduction productivity growth that we all suffer from the last 50 years, and that's really hitting the millennials in the last 20 years. It's something that is a dearth of imagination, but I wouldn't just blame the entrepreneurs because they have all the images in their head. That's usually not the problem. The problem is a population that is enough forward-looking and positive enough to actually put these things into practice. Like the moon landing, there was no reason the moon landing appeared in '68. It could have appeared never or in 2018. But it was a point where this optimism was enough to bubble up with these projects of the future that are big enough, like the Mars landing is now to some, not to a lot of people yet. And if we could get this spirit back, and I don't know if you have a good theory why we kind of lost the spirit of changing the world to the better and asking the big question, but also answering some of them, that seems to be gone since the mid-'70s. And the productivity growth is, I think, the result of this, because we're just not daring enough anymore.
I think you're right. I think we settle for incremental advances and believe that they are leaps when they are not leaps at all. And we actually have to aim higher, I think. And that means part of it is just the marketing inflation, brand inflation. If everything is new and revolutionary, well, everything can't be new and revolutionary. But every app that comes out of Silicon Valley, we're told is going to change the way we do this or that. It's going to change the world. And as I always say, these genius clusters are not only magnets, but they're colanders that separate the good ideas from the bad. And someone has to say, actually, no, that's not going to change it. We don't need an app for that. We don't need that, And it gets back to what's honored in a country is cultivated there. We have to honor the big leaps more, and the leaps that improve humanity, and not just a tiny, tiny segment of humanity or in some insignificant way. I don't know why car insurance is in my head, but an app that would help you with car insurance prices, like, okay. But then people will call it the car insurance genius app. No, it's not a genius app. It's comparing different rates for car insurance and helping you find the best one. That is not on par with Newton or Galileo or any of the other greats.
Yeah. When you did so much research the last couple of years, you went to so many different places. You looked at how geniuses and how philosophy combine to make the world a better place. Now I'll give you another really small question, but it's actually a big one now. It's, Jared Diamond set out with this answer: why do some civilizations develop to this point where they seem to be more advanced? Now, this is a question of debate. What is actually progress? What is advancement? But I don't know if you came across your own little theory for this. Why do some places stay hunter-gatherers forever? Papua New Guinea, lots of places in Africa. Why do some places just burst out in these sporadic genius factories, and then they go back and they forget all about it, like Athens? Or some places seem to they continuously seem to improve on it. Is there something that pushes these places forward? And not necessarily just the geniuses, but also in between, the people adopt this technology, that they become the wiser. Is there a little theory that you have built over the years?
I mean, I think the stagnation is the death of these genius clusters, and arrogance is as well. They're tied together. So in the case of Athens, they became wealthy. They became gourmands, which they had not been. They loved food. And they became decadent, and they also stopped looking for the answers outside. They thought that they had all the answers, and that's the death of a genius cluster. It's always getting back to Montaigne. It's always keeping in mind that what do I know, and that perhaps the answers might be out there. And it's from a very practical level, it's not being isolated and cut off. North Korea has plenty of very intelligent people living there. They don't have a lot of geniuses because they are shut off from the outside world. All these genius clusters that I look at in the geography of genius are places that are at a crossroads where there's a free flow of information and ideas and people, but also a kind of humility, a kind of intellectual humility. That actually, that's fully conscious ignorance, that you know what you don't know, that keeps these places going, that keeps innovation going. Once you decide you've got all the answers, that's the end of a creative place, of a genius cluster. And I think it's human nature, unfortunately, that people, when they become successful, they think they no longer need to look outside themselves for the raw material, for possible solutions. And that, that's where travel and being open to the outside world comes in handy. Because, as I always like to say, we're like fish in a fishbowl, and we're just in one fishbowl, and there are all these other fish bowls, but we don't know they exist, and we don't even know anything exists outside of our fishbowl until we get out, and then we're able to experience those places.
But my counterexample is we say we do these expeditions, and we go to this remote place in Papua New Guinea, and we find these hunter-gatherer societies that have lived like this for 50,000 years, more or less. And then we introduce them to modernity, show them our iPhones, whatever we think is really modern and cool, or our plane or helicopter. They look at it and say, why would I need this? What? So they are not being convinced to any modernity just because they know it exists.
I think their question of why do I need this is a good question. And it's a question we never ask. And we consider them more, quote unquote, primitive than us. Yeah. Yet they are asking, and if we talk about philosophy as the art of asking questions, and the wise person asks good questions, why would I need this is a good question, one we don't ask. And we hear it and we think, oh, they don't recognize the beauty and the genius of this airplane or this helicopter, and there's an assumption that we are light years ahead of them, and that they don't have wisdom and we have wisdom because we have knowledge and technology, et cetera. And I guess I would challenge you to question that assumption. I've got a colleague and friend who wrote a book called Civilized to Death, which is all about this notion that the hunter-gatherers actually had more wisdom than we do and had a better quality of life than we do.
I think I read that book. So there's this whole idea that any specialization and reorganization of human life since the hunter-gatherers, it's been tracked down, it led to increases in productivity, but the individual became more miserable. And since the next generation basically starts off from zero level, they assume this is what it is and that they build on it. The next generation doesn't really care about it. For the individual, especially as you get older, this might put you in trouble because you realize, well, the actual living quality, my freedom, my expression of my life has gotten harder over time. Maybe that's just because we get older, or maybe that's because it's true.
I don't quite follow the question. I have to be honest. Try again.
So,
I mean, are you saying that no, I don't follow.
What I'm saying is that since we always, and it's the example is always the hunter-gatherers move to a place where you are in one spot, like we grow our own crops, and but we also were close to animals, which made us sick, which reduced our living quality. We couldn't go out there and hunt anymore. Like, you can say, is hunting really such a pleasure, or is it really dangerous? Well, there's always an argument against that. Well, it seems like there is a certain happiness to hunt to, if you have the resources around you. There's a certain core happiness in being close to nature in hunter-gatherer societies that you can never emulate again, even if you have beautiful gardens.
Right. And then we come full circle and we find out through our modern science, which evolved out of our sedentary existence in, a post-agrarian revolution that led to the development of science. And then science does research and discovers something that the naturalist E.O. Wilson calls biophilia, which is this notion, very simply put, that nature makes us feel good. And then there are all kinds of studies, and you can read them now. A friend of mine wrote a great book called The Nature Fix by Florence Williams. Highly recommended. It's all about how nature is good for us. It's good for us physically, it's good for us psychologically and spiritually, and in measurable ways. So science now tells us that being close to nature is good for you, right? And we have to get it in these little microdoses, right? Talk about
Yeah.
microdosing. We microdose nature. Do you live in New York? Is that where you are?
San Francisco, yeah.
Okay, but you big city, you probably have to go to find a park, or you have more access than say a New Yorker, but you still have to sort of go out of your way to get your microdose of nature. It's not, you're not living in it full time. And I don't know. That's interesting. What does that tell us? That science can now prove that those hunter-gatherers in some ways were leading more enriching and fulfilling lives than we are. But there's a kind of temporal arrogance that goes along, which comes right out of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. There's the notion of progress. So we are better off than them, right? We are better off than people were a century before, and a century before is better off than the previous century. So this notion that progress is a straight linear line going up and up and up. And we know that because the technology improves. I'm not so sure that's true. What if it's more circular?
Very few people want to go back in time. And you say, well, because they don't know the place, it's not as comfortable as the ones they have. But there is a bunch of communities, like on the East Coast, the Amish people that live like in the 18th century. Not a lot of people see the Amish people and say, oh, that's awesome, I just want to be Amish from now on. No, most people, they just want to stay where they are, right? They don't want to go back in time, even if they could live like a hunter-gatherer tomorrow. I mean, nothing holds you back, and go to Madagascar and go for it.
It's funny, we admire the Amish in some ways, but we don't want to be like them. We admire their simplicity, but we don't want to give up our gadgets and our modern conveniences. It's very strange. I mean, I'll tell you a story, but I was in Bhutan, Himalayan country between India and China. And I was talking to an American tourist who was traveling there, and she saw a woman on the side of the road who was actually Indian, a worker there, who was just, doing some work on the side of the road, but seemed so happy. And the American tourist said, look, she seems so happy, and they have nothing. And I'm like, well, you could have nothing and be happy. And she said, well, they just don't know any better. And I think that's our attitude toward pre-industrial cultures like the Amish. They may be happy, they may live a simple life, which we claim we want. We subscribe to Simple Living magazine. We're all into, simplicity, but we somehow think that they're not with it. They don't know any better. And it's a very strange attitude that we have toward other cultures that actually are doing what we say we want. They're leading simple lives. They're happy. We say we just want to be happy. We just want our children to be happy. It makes me question whether we really want what we think we want. If you want to be happy, and it means even if you have nothing, well, there's an example in Bhutan. If you want to live simply, well, go be Amish. And I don't know. I'm not sure what's going on there, but we're unwilling to accept that others might be onto something.
Yeah. Well, it seems to be, we seem to be driven by something that we don't really know what it wants from us. It's like this higher spirit that drives us somewhere. What we don't know what role we actually play. It's like almost like this DNA has taken us over, right? And it drives us somewhere in the development to an even more complex, better being. But we're just this in between the generations, and we think it's our free will, and it's like we have influence. Yes, we can decide a little bit. But I feel like the influence of our DNA and the way it influences our personality and most of our early lifespan that we have no conscious memory of. I think there's very few people do this, or maybe they did in the past. Philosophers, there is so much pre-programmed that we only get to add a tiny little sliver, but we don't feel it that way. For us, it seems like, oh, we have all these choices. I don't think we do. Very few people actually can see these choices.
Right. We act on autopilot a lot of the time. We chase after goals that we think are our own, but are they? I mean, I talked to a philosopher currently alive, Jacob Needleman, who said basically that these ideas you have are like clothing that you're wearing, except you didn't choose the clothing. And you don't remember putting it on, but there it is, this clothing you're wearing. And shouldn't you question, how did this shirt get here? Did I really want this shirt? Do I need to be wearing a shirt at all? What about some other kind of clothing? So we go through life thinking that, we have chosen our wardrobe and that we love it and it's us. And what philosophy teaches us to do is to stop and question the wardrobe, how it got there, and whether we want it to stick around. Maybe we want to wear something else. But we are, that's the way we treat ideas often. That and people you will mouth ideas that are rooted in 18th century philosophy, ideas about liberty and freedom, and they come out in slogans, but they didn't come from nowhere. They came from people centuries ago really hashing out these ideas, and the previous generations create our common sense. That it's just common sense that people want liberty, or they want this, or these are ideas that are human made, and that's my feeling. And the more aware we become that things that we take to be just the way things are in fact invented by humans, it's kind of liberating, actually. I think, well, then maybe we can look at things differently.
Yeah, it takes a while. I mean, it's like the Matrix, right? So as corny as that it is a movie, there is this core philosophy of you can look outside this matrix and you can build up your own solution of the universe, so to speak. But it also, some ayahuasca or psilocybin does the same thing to you. You feel like you live in something that was given to you, and you live through it, but you don't actually design it. And that's a very strange feeling. I don't know, maybe that's what made so many philosophers so miserable, that they realized that they're just like this molecule being blown by the wind.
Yeah, and I think to be disillusioned is a painful process, and I think that's why maybe so many philosophers have been so unhappy. There's comfort in these illusions, and there is a certain level and comfort of not questioning assumptions, and not thinking too much about these things. But on the other side of it is a kind of freedom that these philosophers and a few other figures throughout history have tasted, and they think it's worth it. And I'm with them on that going through that phase of discomfort to get, it's like, again, the clothing metaphor. I don't know why this comes to mind, but you're wearing a clothing that's uncomfortable, but it's just the way things are, and it's not very attractive, but you've always worn it. You'd have to take it off and be naked for a while before you find some new clothing to put on. And most of us don't want to go through that phase of being naked and picking out a new wardrobe. Philosophers are willing to be naked. That's the title of my next book, The Naked Philosopher.
Yeah, is it for real?
No, I'm just making this up, but it's not bad.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. Maybe Exodus is another alternative.
There you go.
What is your plan for the next book? Is it coffee? Is it consciousness? I mean, what are you looking at right now?
I'm working on a kind of unbiography of Benjamin Franklin, actually.
Okay.
It's the book both is and is not about Ben Franklin. It's about ways we can think and be like him, and he was the first American to be a self-made person and to achieve the American dream. And he's on the $100 bill. But we really don't know that much about him. And it's, that's what it's about. It is not one of these 800-page biographies, but it's more life lessons from this one person. And I've tended to write about many places and many people, but I'm focusing on one person who it turns out I'm discovering was a tremendous traveler living in the 18th century. He lived in England, France, and traveled around. And So that's what
he was in his 80s when he negotiated the deal with the French, right?
He was yes, he would, and he lived till he was 84, which was very old for back then, and he kept taking chances until the day he died. He never stopped learning. And, we're talking via electricity. There's electricity involved in this gadgetry, and he discovered how electricity works. And he lived in an age of the enthusiast, where you could just be a guy in Philadelphia with doing experiments on electricity. And he lived during the whole span of the 18th century, which I will argue in the book is how we got to where we are now, that the 18th century was a pivotal time, and that it was actually much more interesting to be alive then than now, because there was this tug of war between reason and faith, and it wasn't all decided yet. And you could do experiments on electricity and become world famous without any degrees. He had 2 years of education. Yeah.
Well, I'm really excited already to read the book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Ari. That was awesome. It was so enlightening.
Thank you,
really
Torsten.
Appreciate it.
We did philosophy.
I hope so. We earned a judgment.
Yes. Absolutely, we did. We had enlightened kibitzing, as they say. Thank you very much, Torsten. I enjoyed the conversation.
All right, it was my honor. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.